So in the past, I've ranked all the Zelda games and all the dungeons in Ocarina of Time, so I thought, why not officially make this a series? Now if you've actually played Majora's Mask, you're probably like, there's only 4 dungeons, what could you possibly talk about for over 10 minutes? This should be a super short video, right? And yes, you are correct. But to offset this, here are all the key points I will touch on for each temple. Number 1. The lead up to the dungeon, aka the storyline. The story is, in my opinion, one of the best parts of Majora's Mask. The characters and their struggle with grief are far too interesting not to take it into account. Number 2. The dungeons, puzzles, gimmicks, and gameplay. I think this is pretty self-explanatory, but yeah, the dungeons are all unique and have their own little quirks that absolutely need to be talked about. Number 3. The items and masks you use and receive just before and during your time in the dungeon. Number 4. The mini and final bosses. Number 5, and arguably my favorite category, overall vibes. Whatever that means. Alright, without further ado, let's jump into the ranking. Coming in at number 4 is Great Bay Temple. For the third temple of the game, we make our way to the west to Great Bay. As we enter the area, something can be seen floating in the water, and upon further inspection it turns out to be a Zora. After helping the weakened Zora to shore, we find out that his name is Mikau, the lead guitarist of the band the Indogogos. With his last breaths, he sings us a song informing us of his plight. Mikau was tasked with helping the band's singer, Lulu. You see, right before the big show, Lulu's eggs were stolen by the Gerudo, and now instead of practicing, she spends her time depressed and staring off into the ocean. Playing the Song of Healing puts Mikau's soul to rest, and Link picks up where he left off. Once Link successfully sneaks into the Pirate's Fortress and retrieves 4 Zora eggs, we find out that the last 3 are hidden at Pinnacle Rock. Which, getting to Pinnacle Rock is a little interesting to say the least. You see, if you try to go there before speaking with this guy and getting this seahorse, you will probably get lost, making the trip there virtually impossible. So instead, go talk to this guy at the fisherman's hut, and in return for the seahorse, he requests a picture of a Gerudo woman. Why does he want a picture of a Gerudo woman? Who knows? Use your imagination. But after successfully getting the seahorse and saving the 3 remaining eggs from the sea snakes, all the eggs are finally able to be reunited. With all the eggs returned to the Marine Research Lab, they begin to hatch and teach us the new wave Bossa Nova, which is the song needed to awaken the sleeping sea turtle that transports Link to and from the temple. I'm not sure if this is an unpopular opinion, but I actually really like the main gimmick of this dungeon, as I feel like it made progressing pretty straightforward. In the main area of the temple, there's a giant water wheel. Your goal is to use it to your advantage to access different rooms in the temple and to get to the final boss. For example, when you first enter the temple, you turn the yellow switch that pushes the wheel in one direction. As you continue on in the dungeon and flip a series of switches down the only available paths, you're finally able to activate the red switch seen at the beginning of the temple. This will push the water in the opposite direction, thus opening up even more pathways and rooms to explore. As I said earlier, I genuinely feel like this dungeon is pretty straightforward, especially if this is not your first Zelda game. So I was always a little confused as to why people dislike it so much. I say all this while ranking it last, but just hear me out. As long as you understand the main premise on how to progress, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out where to go, especially because there's really only 2 paths open at the beginning, and once you get the dungeon item, the places that were seemingly out of reach become tangible. As for enemies, since there's a lot of underwater escapades, the majority of the enemies tend to be water-based. There's a bunch of skullfish, biodekubabas, multicolored choo-choos, and even Dexy hands lurking around every corner. Literally. Some of these enemies even serve as a means to progress once you get the main dungeon item, which are the ice arrows. The ice arrows are actually used in a lot of interesting ways in this temple. They can be used to create paths between platforms surrounded by water, freeze enemies, thus creating a ledge to reach higher areas, and they can also be used to unblock seemingly off-limit areas. You also tend to use them in tandem with the fire arrows, which I like how the fire arrows weren't completely forgotten. A good example is in this room, where you can unfreeze and refreeze the water, allowing Link to use these giant seesaws to get up to different platforms. In all honesty, you really only need the fire arrows, but if it's your first time playing through this temple, you will definitely need both fire and ice arrows as you figure out the order in which to unfreeze the ice blocks. The next item, and honestly the most important item, is the Zora mask. Now what I'm about to say greatly depends on the version of the game you're playing. For the sake of this video, I will be talking about the Nintendo 64 version because that's the one I played for this video. But I also have to mention how absolutely trash the swimming is in the 3DS version. But back to my main point, the Zora mask allows Link to use the powers Mikau had. We're able to swim, use an electric barrier to defeat some enemies, and even use your Zora fins as boomerangs. I'm not sure about the logistics of this, but it seems like it should be painful. This mask makes doing anything in water possible, both inside and outside of the dungeon. For this temple, there are actually two mini-bosses, with the first one being Wart, and it's safe to say I'm not a fan. The main premise of the fight is to remove these bubbles surrounding this eyeball lizard thing. There's a couple of ways to defeat him. I tried using the bomb mask to blast away some bubbles. The only problem is, the bomb mask has a cooldown period, and you can't use your sword with it equipped. This led to some awkward moments because I clearly forgot to take it off. You can also use fire or regular arrows, and that's pretty decent as well. The last option is using your hookshot, but that's pretty tedious, so I wouldn't recommend it. The whole fight in general just takes a very long time. It feels like there's an infinite amount of bubbles, and then when you finally get a clear shot of the eye, you're then attacked by another random bubble. It's just, I really dislike this fight. It's probably my least favorite mini-boss in the entire game. The second mini-boss is Gecko. Again. But I actually really enjoyed this battle more than the first. Gecko is still pretty goofy, except this time he shields himself with a pile of goo. This fight occurs after you get the ice arrows, so it's pretty easy to figure out what to do. Avoid getting swallowed up by the goo and being beat up like a Dragon Ball Z character, and instead shoot him with the ice arrows when he's on the ceiling. This will cause him to fall. Run up to him, hit him with your sword or arrows, rinse and repeat. A really fun fight in my opinion. The final boss is of course the gargantuan masked fish, Gyorg. A fish as a final boss is very on brand for this temple, huh? In the Nintendo 64 version, it's pretty simple. Shoot Gyorg with an arrow, and then hit him with the electric barrier. And that's it. It's incredibly underwhelming. In all honesty, I actually really like Great Bay Temple as long as you're playing the Nintendo 64 version. As I said before, in the 3DS version, swimming with Zora Link absolutely sucks. He's hard to control, and the changes to the fight with Gyorg are just downright abysmal. Honestly, almost all the boss fights in the 3DS version were worse than their Nintendo 64 counterparts, but this is a video about the temples in general, so I won't go too deep into it. That being said, Great Bay Temple is definitely in last place. Number 3. Snowhead Temple. For this temple, we make our way over to the north. Here we enter Snowhead Mountain, where the Gorons live. If you've played Zelda before, then you know the words snow and Gorons do not belong in the same sentence. After walking around the mountain, talking to the most annoying owl known to man, and obtaining the Lens of Truth, we meet the spirit of Darmani, a powerful Goron that was trying to make his way to Snowhead Temple to put an end to the unusual winter that has fallen over the mountain. Unfortunately, we are talking to his ghost, so of course he was unsuccessful in this task. After playing the Song of Healing, Darmani's soul is finally able to rest, and you are left with a memento, the Goron's Mask. We are now able to take on the spirit of Darmani and his mission to save all the Gorons. Making our way to the Goron Shrine, we are greeted with the sweet sounds of a baby Goron crying for his father. After talking with some of the Gorons, we find out that the Goron Elder has gone to see if he can put a stop to the freezing cold, but hasn't returned yet. If you leave the city and drop down to this area, you can find the Goron Elder trapped in ice. Using hot spring water, we can unfreeze him and tell him about the current situation. Upon hearing how upset his son is without him, the Goron Elder teaches us the Goron Lullaby, which is the song needed to calm down the baby Goron and unlock Snowhead Temple. This dungeon is Backtrack Central. If you love a good backtrack, then this is definitely the dungeon for you. The main gimmick of this temple is that there's a central column that you will need to raise and lower in order to get to the final boss, meaning there's either gaps in the center that you'll need to jump over, or when the column is fully raised, you'll need to find alternate routes in order to move forward. As for enemy diversity in this dungeon, I feel like there was a decent amount. When you enter the dungeon, there's a white Wolfos waiting to greet you. How nice. I've said this before in the past, but I absolutely cannot stand Wolfos as they require a lot of waiting your turn, and I just find it to be annoying. Freezards also make an appearance, although I feel like they act more as a barrier rather than an actual enemy. They either block you from hitting switches or proceeding further on a specific path. There's also Dynalphos, real Bombchus, and Enos. I don't know if I said that correctly, but they're there. I honestly feel like the whole dungeon is a puzzle in and of itself. I can totally understand if someone doesn't really like this dungeon based off that one fact alone. The dungeon can be kind of hard to figure out where you need to go, as there are a lot of doors and paths to take, and the only differentiating feature between these doors are the colors and whether it leads you up or down. It's almost the complete opposite gameplay-wise from the first dungeon. The only things consistently stopping your progress is ice or a locked door, of which there's not too many. But all of this changes once you get the main item of the temple. The main item is of course the fire arrows. Fire arrows are super helpful both inside and outside of the temple. I honestly feel like there's not much to say, just because they kind of act as an upgrade for the bow and arrow you received in the previous temple. The Goron mask is the main mask you receive right before this dungeon and is a requirement to complete the dungeon itself. Inside the dungeon, it helps you to jump or roll over gaps. It also allows you to ground pound switches that can help you to progress. Outside of the dungeon, it makes getting around and taking out enemies in your way 10 times faster. The final item I will mention is the Lens of Truth. If you are trying to 100% the game, or at least all the dungeons, then you will need to collect stray fairies. There are 15 of them per dungeon, and collecting all of them will grant you a gift from the fairy in the surrounding area. There are many fairies hiding in places invisible to the naked eye. In fact, even knowing this, I still managed to miss one hiding in the ceiling of this room. I mean, why would there be a fairy in the ceiling? Come on, Nintendo. There's also another fairy hidden in the side of the wall in the main area. Not only is it hidden, but it's super annoying to get as you literally need to take a leap of faith. Wizrobes serve as the mini-boss of the temple. You actually fight them twice in this dungeon, which under normal circumstances would have been kind of annoying to me, but I honestly don't really mind it for some reason. There's not much variation between both fights, with the second one being slightly harder due to more potential spawn placements. To defeat the Wizrobe, you must figure out which one is real or fake and deal a blow to the real one without getting hit by ice magic. There's a couple ways to do this. I prefer to stand and look at most of the squares until I see him dancing around and then run up and hit him with my sword or a fire arrow. I also noticed Tattle will lock onto the real Wizrobe, thus giving you more confidence to run up and attack. The final boss is none other than the masked mechanical monster, God. This is an incredibly epic boss fight. I would even go as far as saying it's the best boss fight in the entire game. You spend the whole battle chasing Got while rolling around as Goron Link. It's not a hard boss fight at all. You pretty much want to roll directly into Got until he malfunctions and falls. Got also has some counterattacks, such as kicking up boulders and shooting lightning. These counterattacks aren't too hard to avoid, and you get frequent magic and heart refills, so you never really have to panic. Overall, I do think this dungeon has an interesting mechanic, but it is also a bit tedious to complete. It's not as straightforward as the first dungeon and will leave you scratching your head on how to progress. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing, as I thoroughly enjoyed my time with this temple, but sadly I do think it will have to remain in third place. Number 2. Woodfall Temple. As the first dungeon, the lead up is pretty important. However, I will start talking about the story from when you first enter the southern swamp. By making your way to the southern region of the map, you will end up in the land of monkeys and Deku Scrubs. These two have a bit of beef, but we'll get into that in a minute. One of the first things you're tasked with is following a random monkey beckoning you into the woods. If you successfully follow him, he will lead you to find one of the twin Rova sisters, Komei, injured on the ground. If you've played Ocarina of Time, then this is a pleasant surprise. Once you return her to health with the help of her sister Kotake and a red potion, she then allows you to take a free boat ride, which opens up a part of the map that was previously blocked off. At this point, you're also able to talk to a group of monkeys that tell you one of their companions was captured by the Dekus. Taking all this information into account, we make our way to this new part of the map and stumble upon the Deku Palace. In the Deku Palace, only Dekus are allowed. Link transforms into a Deku Scrub and makes his way into the royal chamber, where we see a monkey being dangled above a pot of boiling water. Yup, the Deku Kingdom is about to have Monkey Hot Pot for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Here we find out that the Deku King is accusing the monkey of kidnapping his daughter. Of course, this is untrue, and we must find a way to prove the monkey's innocence. Finding a different entrance into the royal chamber allows us to speak directly with the monkey under prosecution, and he teaches us the Sonata of Awakening. This is the song that allows us to enter Woodfall Temple. This is a fairly straightforward dungeon in my opinion. As the first dungeon, it truly sets the off-putting tone for all the other dungeons to follow. Most puzzles require Link to do some type of platforming, either by running, jumping, or flying, and sometimes there's a bit of a timed aspect as well. Like all the future dungeons, these puzzles also require Link to repeatedly switch between his human and the newly acquired form, in this case Deku Link, based upon the obstacle that stands before him. My favorite room in the dungeon is the perfect example of this. Right before the final boss for this dungeon, you enter a big open room with a lot of fire, dragonflies, and fairies floating around. To get to the other side, you need to use Deku Link to get up and over the specific platform, switch back to human Link, hit a switch with your bow and arrow, quickly transform back into Deku Link, and fly the rest of the way to the other side, all before the fire begins again. Wow, I'm exhausted just saying all that. The puzzles themselves aren't really difficult, as this is a very simple and linear dungeon. If you happen to miss a fairy or you need to go back to a specific room, it's not too hard to find it again. The dungeon layout is pretty centered. As you veer off into different rooms, you'll always find yourself coming back to the center. This is the same type of progression for all the future dungeons as well, but on a smaller scale. I honestly feel like this temple is hard to talk about because there's no real gimmick compared to the rest of them. It's just dark rooms, dragonflies, and vibes. I guess the foliage and theming is what's really driving this temple, and this is seen in the puzzle design as well. For example, you will constantly see flowers depicted both inside and outside of the temple, whether that be the flower pads you use to fly, or the multiple flowers used as platforms. There's also trees growing in the dungeon that kind of act as a natural barrier to progression. It all feels very natural. I don't know if I'm explaining this properly. I feel like I'm giving the curtain is blue vibes, but yeah. As for items and masks, of course the main mask we receive is the Deku mask. And I've talked about it already multiple times in this video, but the bow and arrow is the item you receive in this dungeon. It is both helpful inside and outside, and you will be using it for the rest of the game. The mini-boss for this dungeon is a little evil frog guy named Gecko and his turtle companion Snapper. This is such a goofy mini-boss, as the guy is literally a frog riding around on a turtle. To defeat this boss, you need to transition back and forth between human and Deku Link. Burrow into one of the Deku flowers and wait for Gecko and Snapper to ride over it. Pop out at the right time and send Gecko climbing up the wall. Detransform and use your newly acquired bow and arrow to deal some damage. Rinse and repeat. It's not hard, but it is a really entertaining boss fight. The final boss is the masked jungle warrior Odalwa. As I've said in a previous video, I really don't know how people would feel about this type of villain being showcased in a game that came out today, just based on his overall design and the chanting sounds he makes. All of that aside, I really do love Odalwa. He's a big goofball. There are multiple ways to defeat him, so honestly just try anything and it'll probably work. The way I like to do it is by using my sword, shield, and arrows. But you can also transform into Deku Link, stun him with Deku Seeds, and then use your sword to deal some damage. I've also heard of people using bombs, but I'm not brave enough for all that. Overall, I think this dungeon is one of the best first dungeons out of all the Zelda games. It really does a good job of setting the tone, as it's not too hard, but also serves to get the player accustomed to completing dungeons within the 3-day time limit. Honestly, it's an extremely inoffensive dungeon. Coming in at number 1 is of course Stone Tower Temple. This is a pretty lengthy lead up, and it's a bit all over the place, so I'll try my best to condense the story where I can. Leaving Clocktown, we make our way to the east, to Ikana Canyon. Upon arrival, this one-eyed spirit rejects our request to enter the canyon, and informs us that in order to pass, we will need to obtain a mask that contains wandering spirits. This mask is indeed the Garo's mask, which can be obtained by racing the Gorman brothers over at Romani's ranch. With access to Ikana Canyon and the Garo's mask, Link begins to encounter Garo's spirits, which upon their defeat give him valuable information. One of the valuable pieces of information was that we can revive the river by going to the cave in the north. Inside the cave we meet Sharp, the brother of Flat who taught us the Song of Storms earlier in the game. After playing the Song of Storms to remove the curse placed on him, he then tells us how to find the king of Ikana Castle. With the river now flowing, the music box house starts playing music, which kills all the Gibdos in the surrounding area and the house to unlock. Now, if you spoke to Sakon near the entrance of the canyon, then you would know there's a parent and child that live somewhere in the canyon and they were conducting research on ghosts in the area. With all the Gibdos gone, the child steps out to investigate the area. While she's distracted, Link is able to run inside the house, and that is when we see what appears to be a Gibdo hiding in the closet. Upon further inspection, we can see that this is not a normal Gibdo, and by playing the Song of Healing, we are able to restore the father to his human form. Very grateful for your help, the father gifts you with the Gibdo's mask, allowing you to now speak directly with them. The father also informs us of Gibdo's hiding treasure beneath the well, so of course that is our next stop. After a lengthy trading sequence with multiple Gibdos and a fight with a giant Poe, we come to find out that the treasure in question was the Mirror Shield. This allows us to take on Ikana Castle and to come face to face with the King of Ikana and his guards. I actually really like this fight with the king. It's so goofy and memorable, and it even has a few hidden gems. For example, when fighting the guards, if you take out the Bremen mask and begin to march, the pair will begin to dance around, leaving them open to attacks. Also, when fighting the king, you can take out the captain's hat and watch as he becomes confused as a tiny Skullkita has randomly appeared in front of him. After defeating the king, he then teaches us the Elegy of Emptiness, which allows Link to create statues of his current form and allows us to enter the Stone Tower Temple. The main gimmick of this dungeon is its ability to be turned upside down. When you first make your way through the dungeon, you may notice things on the ceiling and wonder what item you'll get in order to obtain them. It's not until around halfway through that you're finally tipped off on how to flip the dungeon, and once you do it, a whole new world opens up and truly forces you to think outside the box. You can flip the dungeon by hitting a switch on the outside, but there's also some puzzles in the dungeon that require you to flip it from the inside as well. The perfect example of this is a room containing 2 choo-choos and a block. The goal of the room is to get this block in the hole on the other side of the room, but if you start pushing it, you will realize that the floor is raised in certain areas. To mitigate this, you must repeatedly flip the dungeon until you're finally able to get it into the hole. For every room, I can assure you that you will constantly be looking up, down, over, under, left, and right, looking for hidden switches, doors, or just any way you can progress. Something else I love about this dungeon is how it requires the use of all 3 main masks. The Deku, Goron, and Zora mask all play their role in helping Link to progress. There are Deku flowers that obviously require Deku Link to use them to fly across rooms filled with lava that only Goron Link can run through, and long underwater paths that only Zora Link can swim through. Nobody gets left behind. In addition to this, the masks are often used in tandem with the Elegy of Emptiness, and oh boy does it get used a lot within this area. I hope you really like this song because you will be hearing it very often. Anytime you need to hold down multiple switches, you can bet your bottom dollar that you will need to play the Elegy of Emptiness. Not only do you have to listen to the song over and over, but you also have to sit through the cutscene that comes after it. I believe they fixed this in the 3DS version, but it's also been a minute since I've played it. The first item you get that is required for this temple is hidden beneath the well in Ikana Canyon. It's none other than the Mirror Shield. It has a cool design and pretty much acts as one would expect. You use it to reflect light beams at objects or enemies in order to defeat them or progress in a specific area. You don't even have to purposefully use it to reflect light either. Sometimes it will start to do it on its own if you just so happen to be in the light. It's super helpful in this dungeon and in the surrounding area, but outside of it, maybe not as much. The main item of the temple is the light arrows. It's the strongest form of magic arrows that allow Link to bring light and banish darkness. Not only do light arrows virtually replace the need for a mirror shield once you get them, but they're also the key that allows you to flip the dungeon, which is of course needed to complete it. It's also needed to defeat some of the temple bosses, and it's most definitely helpful outside the temple as it makes defeating enemies 10 times faster. The final item you get right before taking on the final boss is the Giant's Mask. As the name states, it turns you into a literal giant, but sadly you're only able to utilize this item during the final boss fight, so I guess I'll talk about it when we get to that section of the video. This temple definitely wins for the most mini-bosses, one of which is a Wizrobe, just slightly more annoying, but I've already talked about him, and there's really no changes to the fight, so let's not do that again. The first mini-boss is the Garo Master. This is a super easy but fun boss fight. I also really like his cape, by the way. His little goofy legs with that big cape is so funny. The Garo Master functions like all the other Garos you fought in the past, just avoid or block his attacks, and then use that moment to hit him back. At the end, you're given the light arrows, and a cryptic message basically telling you how to flip the dungeon. The next mini-boss is Gomez. Gomez is super cool. He's literally Batman. Get it? Because he's made of bats? This is another straightforward yet kind of annoying fight. Gomez is covered in bats that hide his glowing core. Use the light arrows to remove the bats, and then again to shoot the core. He does a couple moves, like scythe swiping and this scythe windmill thing, but they're not impossible to avoid. During my playthrough, I noticed that if you Z-target on him while you're too close, you'll never be able to outrun the range of his scythe. So it's a good idea to run away and reset every now and again. You also never run out of arrows and magic because you will always get some when he sends the bats after you. Thank you, Nintendo. I really appreciate that. The final boss, or bosses, is the giant masked insect, Twin Mold. Twin Mold consists of two flying millipede-like creatures. The only difference between them is the color. The giant's mask is highly recommended if you want to easily defeat this boss. It's also the only point in the game where you're actually able to use it, so you better savor it. To defeat this boss, there are multiple ways to do it, but I opt to turn into a giant and use my sword to randomly slash Twin Mold's tail or face. The giant's mask slowly eats away at your magic, but in my opinion it's not too hard to complete the fight without ever running out of magic. But if you happen to run out, you can always hit these pillars for more. It's a cool and easy boss fight as long as you're playing the N64 version. Overall, I really love this dungeon. I feel like it's a pretty popular opinion to have, but this is one of the best dungeons in Majora's Mask and definitely within the top 10 dungeons from all Zelda games. So, how are we feeling? Do we agree? Do we disagree? What does your ranking look like for this game? I'm genuinely interested in hearing different opinions. These ranking videos take me weeks at a time to complete because I like to play the game and take notes, not to mention recording and editing the video as well. But I'm trying my best to keep my channel semi-consistent. If you have any other video suggestions, let me know in the comments below. As always, my name is Andy, and I hope to see you in the next video.